He's close to Lenin. Lenin is his meal ticket. Lenin is his mentor. He hitches his wagon to Lenin. And Lenin, as you said, is the singular figure. He's the guy that's going to take these people to power. Will, determination, but also tactical flexibility. What people don't understand about Lenin is that he had very deep ideas that he would not relinquish, but he was willing to do whatever was necessary in order to realize those ideas, including repudiate those ideas for a time, what we call ultimate tactical flexibility. And Stalin went to school. He studied Lenin. He became Lenin's pupil. There are a handful of people around Lenin. Stalin is not alone. But there are only 4 people inside the inner regime already from October, November 1917. Trotsky, somebody named Yakov Sverdlov, who's going to die in 1919, looks like from disease. He's the kind of Stalin before Stalin in many ways. He's a great organizer. He's not really a public speaker. He's not really a charismatic figure, but he gets things done. He's a doer, a practical type. Sverdlov, Stalin, Trotsky, and Lenin. This is your regime in 1917. They're the ones empowered to sign government decrees, and they're the ones who meet most often with Lenin and are closest to Lenin. So what we have is Sverdlov's going to die, as we said, in 1919. Trotsky, Stalin, and Lenin. Nobody thinks that Lenin is going anywhere. It's clear that he's the acknowledged leader by everybody, but it turns out he's got several illnesses, debilitating illnesses, and he's going to pass from the scene. So people often ask me, Peter, when does Stalin get in power? So what happens is Lenin, who's the head of the government, which means he's kind of the equivalent of prime minister, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, or the government in the Soviet case, commissars instead of ministers. Lenin appoints Stalin General Secretary of the Communist Party. Now this is a new position, entirely new, that he's created only for Stalin. It's clear that Lenin's done this. We have the documents in his hand. It's clear that he's chosen Stalin. It's clear that he knows what he's doing. Stalin is already performing these functions for Lenin, right-hand man, organizer, head of the party, while Lenin runs the government and makes the big policy decisions. This happens in April 1922. So the Civil War has happened. The Reds have won the Civil War. Trotsky's had a prominent role as the head of the army, the commissar for war. Everybody knows Trotsky.
That's very interesting because Trotsky is not only an intellectual and an orator, he's the flashy figure.
Stalin has a very prominent role in the Civil War too, not as prominent as Trotsky's role. And Stalin is not as well known as Trotsky. But in terms of being close to Lenin, Stalin is at least as close to Lenin, if not more, than Trotsky is. And Lenin relies on both of them. But in April 1922, Lenin makes Stalin General Secretary of the Communist Party.
Right.
Trotsky remains the war commissar at this point. Now, the Communist Party is, in many ways, the ideological and personnel heart of the regime. And so it's a very important position. Stalin will begin to take the position seriously and make it into something and create a personnel machine and an ideological machine. Stalin appointed General Secretary of the party in April 1922, and in May 1922, Lenin has a stroke. He has a debilitating stroke. So the number 1 guy has a stroke, and the number 2 guy, who was never intended by Lenin to be number 1, because Lenin didn't intend to step aside, is all of a sudden in this position where he's got the levers of power in his hands. The General Secretary of the party controls the liaison with the secret police, controls the liaison with the military, controls the liaison with foreign policy, with the embassies abroad, has the cipher codes, communicates all the information to the local party organizations around the country, receives all the secret information. So it's the clearinghouse, it's the center of power, because the Communist Party, right, was loyal, was trusted, was the movement, was what Lenin relied on.
Lenin's last will and testament. Describe what it is and why it mattered. The other fellows didn't just sit back and say, Joe, okay, fine, you got lucky, it's yours. There's months of struggle.
Well, you know, Stalin's in power, Peter. So the struggle is about removing Stalin from power. Zinoviev is not in power. Kamenev is not in power. Trotsky is not in power. Stalin is the general secretary of the party. Already in 1922-23, we have correspondence. Stalin is writing to secret police officials, and they're writing back to him. Well, that was Stalin's job. He was general secretary of the party. And there's the press of events. There's all sorts of decisions that have to be made when you're the center of power. And he's making the decisions. He's, in Stalin's point of view, from his point of view, he's got the whole regime on his back. And he's working 24/7. But from their point of view, he's making decisions behind their backs without their consultation. So they begin to wonder, what could we do about this? Meanwhile, Lenin is sick. He's almost never in the Kremlin, never in the capital, Moscow. He's outside on this estate. The doctors think one diagnosis is it's overwork, and so therefore he should work less. So they try to reduce his workload. His mind is going. He's paralyzed. He loses the ability to write. He loses the ability to speak. The whole right side of his body is paralyzed. He tries to write a little bit left-handed. This is a guy who's collected volumes, run to 55 total volumes, his collected works. And now he's lost the ability to write and in some ways the ability to speak. So he's isolated. He wants to be involved in politics. The doctors say he shouldn't be. And Stalin is in charge of overseeing Lenin because Stalin's in charge of overseeing everything. And so what we see is Lenin thinks he might come back. He's trying to come back. The others are wondering whether he'll come back. He has further strokes until finally he's going to die in January 1924 after the fourth stroke. Right? All this time, between May 1922, the first stroke, and January 1924, there's this ambiguity. Who's going to succeed Lenin? But remember, Stalin has the levers of power in his hand.
He's doing the job.
Right.
Okay.
He's enacting the role of general secretary of the party, which people appreciate because he's getting a lot done. As I show in the book, he was very adept at being general secretary of the party. And the others decide something should be done. Now, what happens, strangely, is there's a party congress without Lenin. This happens in the spring of 1923.
And the party congress is an annual event, biannual? How often is it?
Yes, it's an annual event, and it's the highest decision-making body of the party. And so the party congress is kind of where things get thrashed out. The party congress that takes place in the spring of 1923, Trotsky has his platform, Stalin has his platform. Stalin is the one who has the organizational muscle, and so Trotsky is crushed at this party congress. And it's clear that Stalin has the levers of power. Now, formally, he's in a triumvirate or a threesome with Zinoviev and Kamenev, but they're the ones complaining behind his back that he's exercising power without them. So the triumvirate is a little bit of a facade.
Right.
And as I say, Trotsky is crushed at this party congress. Now, all of a sudden, in May 1923, a document emerges, which is attributed to Lenin, his supposed dictation.
He's still alive at this point.
He's alive, between May 22, the first stroke, and January 24. This is spring, May 1923, so a year after the first stroke. A document emerges from Lenin which says, this person's not that good and this person's not that good, has bad things to say about all potential successors, 6 that Lenin chose to name, supposedly in this document. But Trotsky comes out better than the others in the document. And Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, hands the document to Zinoviev in May 1923. They've known each other for a long time because they were in Zurich together in the European emigration before 1917, and Krupskaya was very friendly with Zinoviev's wife, hands it to him. It's dated December 1922, supposed dictation by Lenin. The document comes forward and has no effect. It doesn't dislodge Stalin, it doesn't reduce his power, it doesn't affect the succession struggle whereby Stalin's in power, Zinoviev and Kamenev are in this facade threesome with Stalin, and Trotsky's out of power. Krupskaya is not necessarily on Trotsky's side. She, however, doesn't want Stalin to be the sole successor to Lenin. She's looking more for a collective, collegial body because Lenin individually is irreplaceable in her mind. The document that comes forward has no effect. And then in June 1923, a second document comes forward, also attributed to Lenin, supposedly his dictation, which is now going to become so-called Lenin's Testament that you were referring to. And this document is allegedly dictated in January 1923. That's the date that Krupskaya has given it. Which means that in May 1923, when she handed the first document over, the second document supposedly existed already.
Existed.
But she didn't hand it in together. But the first one failed. And then she hands in a second one, and the second one says, remove Stalin. So here it is, a little more than a year since Lenin has created the position of General Secretary of the party. And now Lenin is allegedly calling for Stalin's removal from General Secretary of the party. It's a sensational document. It's amazing that something like this comes forward, because Stalin's ability to remain in power against Lenin's wishes would be very dubious, because Lenin is the acknowledged, still alive and the acknowledged leader.
This is published in Pravda. How do people find out about it?
The document is handed or shown, we're not sure, once again by Krupskaya to Zinoviev. And Zinoviev is on holiday in Kislovodsk, a southern resort town, and he goes up in a cave up there on the mountainside with somebody named Bukharin and two others to talk about what to do. Here's a dictation attributed to Lenin calling for Stalin's removal. Now, Zinoviev is a very ambitious guy, Peter. But instead of saying, okay, let's call a meeting immediately in Moscow and let's enact Lenin's wishes, let us remove Stalin. Zinoviev concocts this crazy scheme of implanting himself and one other person in the secretariat of the party alongside Stalin, because Zinoviev has figured out that that's where the power is. And he writes a letter back to Stalin in Moscow. Oh, there's a letter from Lenin about the general secretary position. And this is what we propose. And Stalin says, there's what? There's a letter from Lenin? Now let's backtrack a tiny bit here. Let's talk about Lenin and Gorky at the estate. We have the doctor's journals recording his activities, or actually his inactivities, his inability to write, his inability to speak, his massive headaches, just a debilitated situation. We have other documents at the time testifying also to Lenin's difficulties. But now somehow we have dictation coming from him calling for Stalin's removal. It's very suspicious. We don't know in the end if Lenin dictated these documents or not. We don't know if his wife interpolated his thoughts.
Nobody's looked at it more closely than you.
Well, there is no document. This is the problem. You go to the archives in Moscow and you say, can I read the Testament of Lenin? And you'll get a typescript. Now, in all other matters of dictation, there's a stenographic handwritten document.
Right.
Because if somebody's speaking and you're the secretary, you're writing down not every word, but abbreviations, initials, and then you go back to your office, you go back to the typewriter and you type it up, and then you show it to the boss and the boss initials it, even if the boss can only initial it left-handed because his right hand is paralyzed. But we don't have a document. There is no original stenographic account of Lenin's, quote, dictation. Now, there are other documents around this time that are Lenin's dictation with the handwritten stenographic version. This one, no. All we've got is a typescript. Moreover, the content of the typescript is changing over time. There's going to be a different version in 1923 compared to 1922. There's going to be a different version later in 1923. There's going to be a different version published in 1927. It first becomes Lenin's Testament when it's circulated underground by the Trotskyites, who get called to account for circulating the document, which they've affixed the title Lenin's Testament to. And there's a hearing, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the secret police, which says you're not allowed to circulate this document. And that's another version of the document that we have, the Trotskyite one that's circulated. So we don't have the original. We have suspicious circumstances of its emergence. We have the convenient fact for Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Krupskaya that it calls for Stalin's removal. But once again, Zinoviev has not enacted the removal. He's concocted a different version, implant himself next to Stalin in the Secretariat. Now think about this, Peter. If Stalin was a maniac, if he was a sociopath, if he was dangerous and a murderer, and you had a document from Lenin calling for his removal, just for self-preservation, you would say, let's get this done. Let's remove this guy.
Right.
Let alone what your personal ambition might be to replace him. You want to save the revolution. You want to save yourself physically. Zinoviev writes to Kamenev, who's back in Moscow, working with Stalin, while Zinoviev is in this resort,
Right.
this mineral water town, Kislovodsk. And Kamenev says, now this is a guy, Kamenev, who's known Stalin for 20 years at this point, since 1903. We're in the spring, summer of 1923. He's known him for 20 years. And Kamenev is the guy who gave Stalin the copy of Machiavelli's The Prince in Russian translation. So he's not a naive person.
Right.
You can't call Kamenev naive. Kamenev says, it's not a problem. We don't have to remove Stalin. We don't have to put anybody else in the Secretariat. Kamenev nixes the Zinoviev idea, which is a reaction to the Lenin document.
So that from the moment Lenin makes him general secretary, there's never really a serious, he never teeters on the verge of falling out of power.
If these guys had followed Lenin's supposed wishes, if they had taken that dictation, gone to Moscow, called a meeting, held up the paper, and taken a vote, Stalin was out. But they decided not to. And Kamenev is the critical figure here. Because, once again, people talk about how Stalin's a sociopath.
Right.
And I follow only in real time
Right.
what they said about him. And if he was a sociopath, Kamenev would have known. Because he had known him 20 years.
Either we kill him now or we go to Switzerland.
Right.
Those are the two choices if you're dealing with a dangerous man.
Right. But instead, Kamenev takes Stalin's side and blocks Zinoviev's maneuver, and the testament from Lenin is not enacted in the spring, summer of 1923, but it doesn't go away.
By the time this book ends in 1928, Stalin has been for some years the undisputed ruler of the Soviet
Yes.
Union, and he has not achieved that position by wiping out his enemies. That will follow. But he becomes ruler of the Soviet Union through sheer cunning and force
He's
of personality,
recruiting-
hard work, intelligence,
Yes.
right?
He's recruiting people to his side, he's building institutions, and he's building loyalists throughout the institutions.
Now, you gave a lecture last winter in which you said, and I was sitting in the back of the room taking notes, so this is a direct quotation. The old way of thinking is that Stalin did what he did to consolidate his power. No, I'm quoting you. He did what he did because he was a communist.
Yes.
Explain.
So, what's the big story of the secret archives? What's the big story from all those classified documents that were hidden from us all those years, which in the past 20 years, especially the past 15, have been revealed? And the big secret is, behind closed doors, they spoke the same language, they said the same things as they said in their propaganda. People thought, oh, you know, when we read the secret documents, we're finally going to get the story. No more nonsense about the working class and the bourgeoisie and the imperialists, and they're going to talk what they really, we can relax now. We're off camera, we're behind the scenes, all that crap about the proletariat, the hell with that.
We're a traditional great power. How do we, right.
Right. But instead, behind closed scenes, here they are, talking about the proletariat, the kulaks, the imperialists, the bourgeoisie, all the Marxian categories. Because it turns out that the communists were communists. The minority, who understood that the ideas and the communism mattered, nonetheless thought that Stalin's primary motivation was personal power. But he had the personal power already, Peter. That's one of the things the book shows, I hope meticulously, with the original documents. As you said, through hard work, cunning, intelligence, and also because he stands for something. People perceive him to stand for the values that they had fought the revolution for.